The September rain drummed against the church windows as I watched them lower Grandpa's casket into the Missouri soil. Everyone said he lived a good life. 87 years of farming, raising cattle, and watching his grandchildren grow. But standing there in my black suit, feeling like a stranger among my own family, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Uncle Martin and Uncle David flanked my father, their faces appropriately somber. They'd driven in from the city the night before, their expensive cars looking out of place next to the pickup trucks in the church parking lot. I hadn't seen much of them over the years. They'd left the farming life behind decades ago, pursuing careers in law and real estate respectively. After the service, we gathered at Grandpa's farmhouse, the same house where I'd spent countless summers, learning to milk cows and fix fence posts. Now it felt different, heavy with unspoken tension. My uncles moved through the rooms like they were appraising everything, their eyes calculating values I couldn't begin to understand. "We need to discuss the estate," Uncle Martin announced over coffee and casseroles brought by neighbors. His lawyer's voice cut through the quiet conversations. The will was clear. The farm gets divided equally among the three sons. I looked at my father, expecting him to say something, but he just nodded quietly. That's when I noticed Uncle David removing papers from Grandpa's old roll-top desk, stuffing them into a briefcase with casual efficiency. "What about Jamie?" my father finally asked, gesturing toward me. "Dad always said the farm would stay in the family." "The farm will stay in the family," Uncle Martin replied smoothly. "We'll keep it for a few years, maybe lease it out, then decide what's best. Jamie can visit whenever they want." Visit. Like I'd be a tourist in the place that had shaped me more than any other. I was 25, fresh out of agricultural college, ready to breathe new life into the old place. But apparently that didn't matter now. 3 days after the funeral, I returned to the farmhouse alone. My uncles had gone back to their city lives, leaving me to help sort through Dad's things, as they put it. The house felt impossibly quiet without Grandpa's presence. No morning coffee brewing at 5 a.m., no evening news playing on the old television, no creaking floorboards as he made his nightly rounds, checking doors and windows. I wandered through the rooms, each one holding a lifetime of memories. The kitchen where Grandma had taught me to make biscuits before she passed 10 years ago. The living room where Grandpa and I would plan the next season's crops over glasses of sweet tea. The front porch where we'd sit in the evenings, watching fireflies dance over the pastures. Everything felt frozen in time, yet somehow already slipping away. I could see my uncle's influence everywhere. Furniture moved, drawers rifled through, family photos mysteriously absent from their usual spots. They worked fast, I'd give them that. In Grandpa's bedroom, I found his old cedar chest open, its contents scattered. Letters, photographs, his military medals from Korea, all mixed together like someone had been searching for something specific. I carefully sorted through everything, trying to restore some order to the chaos my uncles had left behind. That's when I found the insurance papers showing the fire damage to the barn from 15 years ago. The same fire where Uncle Martin claimed the original will had been destroyed. Convenient timing, I thought, considering it happened just 2 months after my uncles had visited for what they called a family business meeting. I'd been away at college then, focused on my studies and completely unaware of any family drama. But now, looking at those insurance documents, I began to wonder what else I might have missed. What conversations had taken place in this house while I was gone? What decisions had been made without me? On my 4th day in the house, I decided to tackle Grandpa's workshop in the basement. He'd always been meticulous about his tools and supplies, everything labeled and organized with the precision of a man who'd spent decades making the most of what he had. The workshop smelled of motor oil, leather, and the earthy scent of seeds and fertilizer. I started with the workbench, sorting through coffee cans full of screws and nails, old catalogues for farm equipment, and hand-drawn plans for various building projects. Grandpa was old school. He preferred to sketch his ideas on paper rather than use any computer programs. Each drawing showed his careful attention to detail and his deep understanding of practical engineering. Along the far wall stood a series of wooden drawers he'd built himself, each one labeled with faded masking tape. Corn seeds, bean seeds, tomato seeds, flower seeds. I'd helped him organize these drawers every spring, preparing for planting season. Even though it was September, I found myself checking each drawer out of habit, making sure everything was still properly stored. The corn seed drawer stuck when I tried to open it, warped slightly from years of basement humidity. I had to work it back and forth several times before it finally gave way with a sharp crack. Seeds scattered across the floor, and I cursed under my breath, dropping to my knees to gather them up. That's when I saw it. A manila envelope taped to the underside of the drawer, yellowed with age and partially hidden by the accumulated dust of years. My hands trembled slightly as I carefully removed the tape and pulled the envelope free. It was heavier than I expected, and when I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. Inside were legal documents, all bearing Grandpa's signature and official seals. The top document was labeled Last Will and Testament of Thomas Harold Peterson, dated just 3 years ago, 2 years after the supposed fire that destroyed the original will. But this wasn't the will my uncles had read at the lawyer's office. This will told a completely different story. According to this document, Grandpa had left the entire farm, all 847 acres, the house, the barns, the equipment and the livestock to me. Not divided among his 3 sons, but specifically and exclusively to his grandchild, who had shown the dedication, knowledge and love for the land that this farm deserves. The will was detailed and specific, listing every asset down to the vintage tractor I'd learned to drive when I was 12. But more importantly, it included a handwritten letter attached to the back in Grandpa's unmistakable script. Jamie, if you're reading this, then something has happened to the will I filed with my lawyer in town. I've suspected for some time that Martin and David have been pressuring your father to sell the farm once I'm gone. They see dollar signs where we see home. I won't let that happen. This land has been in our family for 4 generations, and it deserves to stay with someone who understands its value beyond money. You've got farming in your blood, just like your great-grandfather did. Don't let them take this from you. The letter was dated 6 months ago, and reading it felt like having one final conversation with Grandpa. I could almost hear his voice, steady and certain, the way he sounded when he was teaching me about crop rotation or explaining why we needed to check the fence line after every storm. But along with the relief of knowing Grandpa's true intentions came a cold realization about what my uncles had done. They hadn't just misplaced the original will or suffered an unfortunate accident with a barn fire. They had deliberately destroyed it and replaced it with a forgery that served their interests. I sat in that dusty basement for nearly an hour, processing the magnitude of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about money or property, it was about family, legacy, and the kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than any physical wound. My uncles had looked me in the eye at the funeral, had listened to me talk about my plans for the farm, knowing they intended to steal it all along. I spent the next 2 days going through every document in the house with forensic precision. If I was going to challenge my uncles, I needed more than just a copy of the real will. I needed proof of their deception. Grandpa had always been meticulous with his record keeping, and I prayed that habit would serve me now. In his filing cabinet, I found correspondence with his lawyer, Harold Brennan, dating back 15 years. The letters showed a clear pattern. Grandpa had updated his will 3 times over the years, each time becoming more specific about leaving the farm to me. The last letter, dated 8 months ago, explicitly mentioned his concerns about his son's intentions and his decision to keep a copy of the will in a safe place they'd never think to look. I also found bank records showing several large cash deposits Uncle Martin had made into Grandpa's account over the past 2 years, always with memos like estate planning consultation or legal advice fee. It seemed he'd been positioning himself as Grandpa's financial advisor, gaining access to sensitive information about the estate. Most damning was a folder I discovered tucked behind other files, containing photocopies of correspondence between Uncle Martin and a law firm in Kansas City. The letters discussed asset protection strategies and will modification procedures in language that was clearly designed to circumvent Grandpa's actual wishes. My first call was to Harold Brennan's office. His secretary informed me that he'd retired suddenly 3 months ago, citing health issues. When I asked for his forwarding address, she claimed she wasn't authorized to provide that information. The timing of his retirement, so close to Grandpa's death, seemed awfully convenient. I decided to drive into town and start asking questions in person. At Murphy's feed store, I struck gold. Old Pete Murphy had been selling supplies to area farmers for 50 years, and he remembered several conversations with Grandpa about his plans for the farm. "Your granddad was proud as punch about you taking over," Pete told me as we stood among the stacked feed bags. "Said you had more farming sense in your little finger than his boys had in their whole bodies. He was worried about them, though. Said they'd been asking too many questions about land values and tax assessments." Ooh, word travels fast in small farming communities, and by my 6th day back, several neighbors had stopped by to check on me and share their own suspicions about my uncle's sudden interest in the farm. The most helpful visitor was Sarah Mitchell, who owned the adjacent property and had been Grandpa's closest neighbor for 25 years. "I saw your uncles here several times over the past year," she told me as we sat on the front porch, watching her border collie chase squirrels in the yard. "Usually, when you weren't around, they'd drive up in those fancy cars, stay for a few hours, then leave looking pretty satisfied with themselves." Sarah had been a paralegal before she retired to farm, and she understood the legal implications of what I'd discovered better than most. She examined the copied will carefully, noting the official seals and witness signatures. "This document looks legitimate," she said. "The question is whether you can prove the will your uncles presented was falsified. That's going to require expert analysis, maybe even forensic examination of the documents." She offered to make some calls to legal contacts from her former career, people who specialized in estate disputes and document authentication. More importantly, she offered to serve as a character witness, testifying to Grandpa's repeated statements about leaving the farm to me. That evening, I received an unexpected phone call from Harold Brennan's former secretary, Martha. She'd gotten my number from Sarah, who apparently knew her from church. Martha sounded nervous, but determined to share what she knew. "Mr. Brennan didn't retire because of health problems," she whispered into the phone. "Your Uncle Martin pressured him to close his practice after your grandfather died. Made some threats about reporting him to the state bar for various supposed violations." Harold was scared. He's 73 years old and didn't want to fight. She arranged to meet me the next day at a coffee shop in the county seat, away from prying eyes and listening ears. When we met, Martha brought a briefcase containing copies of all the documents related to Grandpa's estate that she'd managed to save before Martin forced the office closure. "Your grandfather came to see Mr. Brennan 6 months before he died," she explained over coffee and pie. "He was agitated, said he suspected someone had been going through his papers at home. He wanted to make sure his real will was properly filed and couldn't be tampered with." The documents she showed me included the original will, identical to the copy I'd found in the seed drawer, along with Harold Brennan's detailed notes about Grandpa's concerns regarding his son's intentions. Armed with evidence and witness statements, I knew it was time to confront my uncles directly. I called Uncle Martin first, using my most casual tone to request a family meeting about settling some details regarding the farm. He agreed readily, probably assuming I wanted to discuss the logistics of their takeover. We arranged to meet at the farmhouse on Saturday afternoon, with Uncle David and my father also attending. I spent Friday preparing for what I knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. These weren't strangers I was accusing of fraud. They were family members who had been part of my life since childhood. Saturday arrived grey and cold, with the kind of October weather that hints at the harsh winter to come. My uncles arrived together, having driven out from the city in Uncle Martin's Mercedes. My father came separately, looking uncomfortable and confused about the purpose of the meeting. We gathered in the living room, where just weeks earlier we discussed funeral arrangements and shared memories of Grandpa. The atmosphere felt completely different now, charged with tension and unspoken accusations. "So, Jamie," Uncle Martin began in his smooth lawyer's voice, "David and I have been discussing the farm's future. We think the best approach would be to lease the land for a couple of years while we evaluate the market, then make a decision about selling. The farm equipment can be auctioned off next month." "Before we discuss any of that," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I think you should see something I found." I placed the copied will on the coffee table between us. The reaction was immediate and telling. Uncle David's face went pale, while Uncle Martin's expression shifted from confident to calculating in an instant. My father leaned forward to examine the document, his confusion evident. "Where did you find this?" Uncle Martin asked, his lawyer's training helping him maintain some composure. "In Grandpa's workshop. He hid it where he knew you'd never think to look." I watched their faces carefully as I continued. "It's interesting that this will, dated after the barn fire, tells a very different story than the one you presented to the lawyer." The silence that followed was deafening. Uncle David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Uncle Martin stared at the document as if trying to will it out of existence. "This changes everything," my father said quietly, finally understanding the magnitude of what had been kept from him. "That document isn't legally binding," Uncle Martin said after a long pause, falling back on his legal training. "The official will was properly filed and witnessed. This is just a copy of an outdated draft." But his words lacked conviction, and I could see the calculation in his eyes as he tried to figure out how much I actually knew. It was time to show my hand. "I've been doing some research," I said, placing Martha's documents on the table alongside the will. "I've spoken with Harold Brennan's former secretary, and I know about your visits to his office. I know about the pressure you put on him to retire. I also have witness statements from neighbors who heard Grandpa discuss his plans for leaving the farm to me." Uncle David finally spoke up, his voice shaky. "Martin, maybe we should—" "Shut up, David," Uncle Martin snapped, his composed facade cracking for the first time. The sudden harshness revealed more than any confession could have. Uncle David was sweating now, constantly wiping his hands on his pants. "Martin said it would be simple, that nobody would ever know. He said the old man was getting senile anyway, that his judgment couldn't be trusted. We burned it in the fireplace," he continued, his voice barely audible. "Martin said it was the only way to make sure the farm wouldn't be wasted. He said you would understand eventually." The admission hung in the air like smoke. My father sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that his brothers had manipulated him as thoroughly as they'd tried to manipulate me. The confrontation ended with Uncle Martin storming out, threatening lawsuits and claiming I'd never be able to prove anything in court. Uncle David followed reluctantly, apologizing quietly, but still choosing his brother over what was right. My father stayed behind, sitting in shell-shocked silence. "I should have seen it," he said finally. "The way they kept pushing Dad to simplify his affairs, their sudden interest in the farm's finances. I thought they were just trying to be helpful." Within days, I had hired Sarah Mitchell's recommended attorney, Elena Rodriguez, a sharp estate lawyer from the state capital who specialized in will contests and fraud cases. Elena reviewed my evidence with professional thoroughness, asking detailed questions and taking extensive notes. "You have a strong case," she told me during our first formal meeting. "Document forgery, destruction of legal documents, fraud, these are serious charges. The challenge will be proving everything in court, especially since they've destroyed the original will and intimidated key witnesses." She explained that estate litigation could be expensive and time-consuming, potentially taking years to resolve fully. Meanwhile, my uncles would likely try to sell off farm assets or find other ways to complicate the legal process. Elena's first step was to file an emergency injunction, preventing any sale or disposal of farm assets until the court could determine the will's validity. This legal maneuver caught my uncles off guard. They'd been moving quickly to liquidate equipment and livestock. Uncle Martin responded by hiring a high-powered firm from Kansas City, the same one I'd seen referenced in Grandpa's hidden documents. Their first move was to challenge the authenticity of the will I'd found, claiming it was a forgery I'd created to support a fraudulent claim. The irony was almost laughable. They were accusing me of the exact crime they'd committed. But Eleanor had anticipated this strategy, and we were ready with expert witnesses who could authenticate the document's age, ink, paper, and signature characteristics. What surprised me most during those difficult months was the outpouring of support from the farming community. People who had known Grandpa for decades rallied around the fight to preserve his wishes and keep the farm in operation. The Peterson Harvest Festival, an annual tradition Grandpa had started 20 years earlier, became an impromptu fundraiser for my legal expenses. Neighbors donated money, time, and expertise, organizing everything from bake sales to equipment auctions. Sarah Mitchell coordinated much of the effort, turning her dining room into an unofficial campaign headquarters. "Your grandfather meant something to this community," she explained, as we sorted through donation envelopes one evening. "He was always the first person to help when someone's barn burned down or when a neighbor needed extra hands during harvest. People remember that, and they want to honor it." Pete Murphy from the feed store organized a petition signed by over 200 local residents, attesting to Grandpa's character and his frequently stated intentions regarding the farm's future. The petition also detailed my uncle's absence from community life and their lack of connection to agricultural activities. Harold Brennan finally agreed to a recorded deposition despite his fear of legal retaliation from Uncle Martin. During the deposition, he provided detailed testimony about my uncle's attempts to manipulate Grandpa's estate planning and their threats against him personally. "Tom Peterson was one of the most mentally sharp people I'd ever met," Brennan stated on record. "Right up until his death, he was completely competent and clear about his intentions. He wanted that farm to go to Jamie, and he was worried his sons would try to interfere with those wishes." The local newspaper picked up the story, running a front-page article about the Peterson family will dispute that brought forward additional witnesses, people who remembered conversations with Grandpa about his concerns and his plans for the farm's future. After 8 months of legal maneuvering, depositions, and expert testimony, the case finally went to trial. The courthouse was packed with community members, family friends, and local media covering what had become a symbol of the ongoing tension between agricultural preservation and development pressures. Elena had prepared meticulously, organizing our evidence into a compelling narrative that painted a clear picture of my uncle's fraud. She began with Grandpa's character and his deep connection to the land, establishing through witness testimony that he was mentally competent and clear about his intentions right up until his death. The authentic will I'd found in the seed drawer became the centerpiece of our case. Document experts testified that the paper, ink, and signatures were all consistent with the date on the document and that it showed no signs of forgery or tampering. They also analyzed the will my uncles had presented, finding several inconsistencies that suggested it had been altered or completely fabricated. Harold Brennan's testimony was particularly powerful. Despite his age and obvious discomfort with the courtroom setting, he provided clear, detailed evidence about my uncle's attempts to manipulate the estate planning process. His records showed a pattern of pressure and intimidation that supported our fraud allegations. Uncle Martin's defense team tried to portray me as a young opportunist who had forged documents to steal an inheritance that rightfully belonged to Grandpa's sons. They argued that Grandpa's supposed concerns about his sons were actually signs of mental decline and paranoia, not legitimate fears about their intentions. But their strategy backfired when they put Uncle David on the stand. Under Elena's skilled cross-examination, his composure crumbled completely. He admitted to participating in the destruction of the original will, confessing that Martin had convinced him it was necessary to protect the family assets from poor decisions. "We burned it in the fireplace," he said, his voice barely audible. Martin said it was the only way to make sure the farm wouldn't be wasted. He said Jamie would understand eventually that we were doing the right thing for everyone. The courtroom was silent except for the soft scratching of the court reporter's machine. Uncle David's admission was the breakthrough we'd hoped for, but hearing it still felt like a punch to the stomach. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a unanimous verdict in my favor. They found that the will I'd discovered was authentic and legally binding, and that my uncles had committed fraud by destroying the original document and presenting a falsified version. The judge ordered the immediate transfer of all farm assets to me, along with punitive damages for the legal expenses and financial losses caused by their actions. But victory in court felt strangely hollow as I watched my uncles leave the courthouse. Uncle David looked broken, his shoulders slumped in defeat and shame. Uncle Martin maintained his defiant posture, but I could see the calculation in his eyes as he considered his next move. Probably an appeal that would drag the process out even longer. My father approached me outside the courthouse, his expression mixing relief with profound sadness. The trial had revealed the depth of his brother's deception and their willingness to manipulate him along with everyone else. "I'm proud of you for fighting this," he told me, his voice heavy with emotion. "Your grandfather would be proud too, but I'm sorry it had to come to this. Sorry you had to see the worst side of our family." Eleanor warned me that my uncles would likely appeal the verdict and continue fighting through every available legal channel. But I also had something they didn't, the support of a community that understood what was really at stake. 1 year after finding that yellow document in the seed drawer, I stood in the same workshop where it all began, preparing for my first full planting season as the farm's owner. The legal battles weren't completely over. Uncle Martin had filed an appeal as predicted, but the immediate threat was past, and I could finally focus on the work Grandpa had trained me to do. The farm bore scars from the months of neglect and uncertainty. Fences needed repair, buildings required maintenance, and several fields needed soil restoration after lying fallow. But there were also signs of renewal and hope. New equipment sat in the machinery shed, financed through agricultural loans and community fundraising. The cattle herd, depleted by my uncle's hasty sales, was slowly being rebuilt with stock from neighboring farms. Sarah Mitchell had become an unofficial advisor, helping me navigate the complex business and legal aspects of farm management. Her background in law proved invaluable as we worked through insurance claims, equipment contracts, and ongoing litigation related to the will dispute. "Your grandfather was smart to hide that copy," she reflected as we reviewed the spring planting schedule. "He knew his sons well enough to predict their behavior and plan accordingly. That document didn't just preserve his wishes, it preserved everything he'd worked for." My father visited regularly now, finding peace in the familiar rhythms of agricultural life that he'd abandoned years earlier for office work. Our relationship had strengthened through the shared trauma of the legal battle and our mutual commitment to honoring Grandpa's memory. "He knew you'd fight for this place," Dad told me one evening as we watched the sunset from the front porch. "He saw something in you that the rest of us missed, the kind of determination it takes to preserve something worth preserving." The annual Harvest Festival had grown into a regional celebration that brought agricultural families together from across 3 counties. As I watched children learn the same lessons Grandpa had taught me about planting seeds and caring for animals, I understood the deeper meaning of his trust in me. This wasn't just about inheriting property or continuing a family tradition. It was about preserving a way of life that connected people to the land and to each other. The farm represented values of hard work, community support, and environmental stewardship that were increasingly rare in modern American life. The community's support had evolved from crisis assistance to genuine partnership. Several neighboring farmers had agreed to coordinate crop rotations and equipment sharing, creating efficiencies that benefited everyone involved. We were stronger together than any of us could be alone. As spring turned towards summer and the first crops began to emerge from the dark Missouri soil, I felt Grandpa's presence in every aspect of the farm's renewal. His wisdom guided my decisions. His values shaped my relationships with neighbors and customers, and his love for the land inspired my daily work. Standing in those same fields where he'd taught me to recognize the signs of healthy soil and changing weather, I made a silent promise to continue his work and pass his wisdom on to the next generation. The farm would remain in the family, not because of legal documents, but because someone was willing to fight for what really mattered. The legal documents might have established my ownership, but the real inheritance was something deeper: the knowledge, skills, and commitment needed to be a true steward of the land. Uncle Martin and Uncle David had seen only financial assets to be liquidated, but Grandpa had understood that some things are worth more than their market value. Sometimes, the most important documents are hidden in the places people would never think to look. Sometimes, preserving what matters most requires standing up to those closest to us. And sometimes, the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the wisdom to know what's truly worth fighting for. Thank you so much for listening to this story about family, betrayal, and the fight to preserve what matters most. I hope it reminded you of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it means confronting difficult truths about the people we love. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please tell me what part of the world you're listening from, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales of family drama, small-town secrets, and the ongoing struggle to preserve American agricultural traditions. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with truth, determination, and the support of people who believe in what's right. Fighting for what's right is always worth the cost. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.